It's extremely kind of IFPRI to put this on. I think this is a great opportunity to present some ideas on school feeding. I'm going to focus around this book, which was produced jointly with the World Food Programme, called Rethinking School Feeding. And I'd just like to point out that one of the other authors, Leslie Drake, is also here in the front row there. And one of the peer reviewers was Harold. So just to complete that circle, despite my youthful appearance, I actually have some experience in the child development area, and my recollection of school feeding, the received wisdom on school feeding was that it was relatively expensive, that the benefits were unclear, particularly in terms of nutrition. And something we used to really focus on was this issue which was called an exit strategy. What happened when the school feeding program stopped? What did you do after that? Those were great preoccupations, and I think very much pervaded a lot of development thinking around the use of school feeding. Well, last year in May, the World Bank launched something called the Global Food Crisis Response Program, a $2 billion program that was aimed at supporting agriculture and social protection responses to the food crisis, the fuel crisis, the financial crises. And somewhat to our surprise, we discovered that a lot of the programs that were coming out of this were in fact school feeding programs, that there was a great deal of interest, a great deal of demand, both from countries and from the social protection sectors for school feeding programs. And this was mainly looking at school feeding as a social safety net, but also looking at it as a long-term support for human capital development, for keeping children in school. And so we decided we'd better look at this issue more carefully, and we worked together with the World Food Programme, starting with a concept note in June last year, and then publishing this report in June this year on those analyses. And I'm going to focus really on what we came up with in this analysis. I'm just going to show you a couple of maps. We're talking about school feeding, so here are some issues germane to that. Where are the poor children? Where's the poverty? This is a poverty mapping, a global poverty mapping, World Bank data. Red is bad. No surprises where that is. This is hunger. This is FAO, World Food Programme data. Where is hunger in the world? And again, red is bad. And then primary school completion, measure of school participation, UNESCO data. And here again, red is bad. And then finally, a graph that we produced, a map that we produced together with the World Food Programme of where school feeding was going on in the world. And it's no surprise to us to discover that the places where there is least coverage with school feeding, and perhaps least effort with school feeding, is also those places most in need. Anyone in development knows that that's often the vicious cycle. But what was a surprise to us is that although we have a red category, which is no school feeding, we couldn't actually find any countries that fitted into that category. Indeed, what we found from this was that all those countries that can afford to provide school feeding, rich countries and middle-income countries, do so, and that the low-income countries all do so to some degree in some form. And so we see this now then as rather a different picture from the one we had thought of. I think there's a particular moral issue in the fact that rich countries do this for their children universally. I mean, I can point out that the US has a very extensive school feeding program, even though welfare programs in general are not well represented. But I'd make the particular point in this is that the thing that had worried us for so many years, called the exit strategy, And the issue of, well, we're going to persuade countries to start something that they can't get out of, well, actually, that's not a real concern, because we couldn't find countries that weren't trying to do this. So this made us begin to think what really was going on here. Why were countries providing food for all their school children? And I think that Dan may come on to some of that as an issue as to how do you keep children in school, how do you keep children at school for a day if you don't feed them. But we began to look at what were the benefits of school feeding in these contexts. And one of the original issue that had caught our attention was school feeding as a social safety net. And it became clear as we looked at what was going on in terms of social protection responses that school feeding in many cases, in many countries, was seen as an opportunity to reach the poorest children quickly. It's I've got a list here. This is from Margaret Grosh's excellent book on safety nets, recently published. A list of the key issues or the benefits of a social safety net. And school feeding in particular is relatively easy to scale in a crisis. Those programs in many countries are already in place, and therefore one can quickly reach the poor children. They're often quite a good transfer. They can be quite substantial. In the case of take-home rations, very substantial. They can often be equitable. In other words, they can often be progressive in the sense of targeting very specifically poor children, provided the targeting mechanisms themselves are effective. Cost effectiveness varies depending on the costs, the non-transfer costs, the costs of actually running the programs. And we actually, this is an area where we have very, very poor data. In fact, it's an area you'll discover that the lack of data is one of the big issues in looking at school feeding. But it may well be that school feeding is more cost-effective than we've been seeing it up till now. Anyway, the main point of this is that that safety nets, that school feeding can provide a social safety net. And within the bank, as you may know, the idea of conditional cash transfers is very much uppermost in the thinking in this area. But I want to share two things with you on that. One is that in those countries where we know there are the best conditional cash transfer programs, and that they would all be in Latin America at this point, all of those countries also have national school feeding programs. And in Africa, where most of the countries are that we really want to target with social safety nets, in those countries, conditional cash transfers are very much the exception, whereas school feeding programs are present in most. And that partially explains why the school feeding issue became so important in response to the financial crisis. Education, I'm not going to dwell on the education benefits. Dan is going to, has already published on this extensively, excellent publication in that area. But I just want to make 2 points on this. One is that there is good evidence for educational benefits, but the evidence is for a number of benefits in terms of enrollment and attendance, but also in terms of achievement and cognition. And I emphasize that because the cash transfer alternative, which has certain attractions as a modality, the cash transfer alternative doesn't, of course, benefit the cognition and educational achievement end. It's food that's necessary to recoup those benefits. And then the final area which we looked at briefly was the area of nutrition, and I'm going to take that as an area of discussion as we go forward, except to say that it's clear that school children wouldn't be your first choice for a nutritional intervention. That's too late. But that's not to say that there are no nutritional benefits to school children, and certainly both micronutrients and some of the supplementary approaches, such as deworming combined with school feeding, have significant nutritional benefits for school-aged children. One interesting issue is that when we actually looked at real school feeding programs, these issues, why you were doing it, were very rarely discussed. And as we'll see later, less than a quarter of the school feeding programs have any kind of policy environment. So the objectives of programs are often not defined. So we would just like to say here that it's clear that from a social safety net point of view and an education point of view, there are real benefits from school feeding. And that countries need to decide on why they would adopt those policies. This rather complicated-looking figure you will come up against again because Harold is going to discuss this. And this is trying to look at the issue of costs. And I want to say straight away that cost data were some of the most difficult data to get on school feeding. What this shows is, on the vertical axis, it shows the ratio between the cost of primary education and only primary education and the per capita, and school feeding per capita. The one you may think of as 100%. And if it's 100%, it means the cost of school feeding is the same as the cost of education. On the bottom axis, we have the GDP per capita. So that's ranking now from low-income up to high-income countries. And what do we see here? Well, we notice for the low-income countries remarkable variance in the cost, huge variance in the cost. We can see some countries, and Benin is highlighted here, where the cost of school feeding is actually more than the cost of the education. But in exactly equivalent countries in terms of GDP, we can see countries like Kenya where school feeding is 5% of the cost of education. There's huge variation there. Why is that? What does that mean for our potential for cost savings, for looking carefully at how school feeding is being provided? And yet, as the wealth of the country rises, as we look at middle-income and high-income countries, we can see that the proportion of school feeding, the relative cost of school feeding relative to the cost of education, declines to some figure around 10 to 15%, and is remarkably consistent at that end. This, I think, was really quite important for our thinking about the opportunities for cost saving, particularly in low-income countries, or for the need to invest in low-income countries to help them move to transition from this highly variable area to the area where the costs are much more contained. Related to that, and the final point I want to make, is the issue of transition of school feeding. And this comes back to the point I raised at the beginning about an exit strategy. We always used to talk about an exit strategy. Well, it turns out countries don't want to exit from school feeding. They actually want to do school feeding. So this was not actually, as it turns out, a helpful concept that we created for ourselves. And the question really isn't about exiting, it's about transitioning. How do you get from being a country on the far left-hand side of this chart, where there's a great deal of dependency on external support both for financing and for implementation, to countries on the right-hand side where the programs are supported and implemented entirely by the countries. We've, I think, looked at 32 case studies of countries with WFP who have made this transition across from one side to the other. And there are some countries on the right-hand side who are actually helping their neighbors in the same process. Clearly, one of the important things we need to understand is what makes that transition happen. And it's not just about money if you look at the countries that are on that list. It's not simply about finances. One of the issues, we think, is the issue of local procurement of food, where the food comes from. Those on the right pretty well all procure their food locally. This has become a really important issue in thinking about where food comes from and how to sustain programs. It may also have relevance in terms of creating agricultural opportunities. And the second issue is the issue of how does school feeding fit into the country's development policy. Here is a histogram taking those stages, again moving left to right, just showing the proportion of countries that actually included school feeding in their education sector plan. And you can see that those countries on the far left, those at stage one, in general don't actually have any kind of development policy that includes school feeding. no surprise then that this exit strategy phenomenon arose. If there's no policy to do school feeding, no systematic inclusion of school feeding, then of course when the external supporter goes away, then the program will fail. So the issue of looking at school feeding as part of a development dialogue, of looking at it in terms of the overall costs of investment in the development of children, is crucial, we're proposing, in terms of ensuring the longer-term sustainability of school feeding programs. We didn't, as I said, that the World Food Programme and the World Bank worked together on this issue. We didn't leave it at that, because having done this analysis, clearly the next step is to see how applicable this is in the real world. And we will shortly be announcing a joint partnership working in groups of countries to actually work with the governments and with other development partners on the issue of school feeding, to look at whether there are efficiency savings, look at those ranges of costs that we saw in low-income countries, and also to look at the policy dialogue. Where is school feeding in terms of the way the country perceives of its child development programs? So that's the next step, and I look forward to Joachim, to you inviting us back to talk a bit about how that pans out in practice. Thank you very much.